My name is William Gallagher. I am 70 years old, a retired structural engineer who spent 4 decades building foundations meant to last lifetimes. I designed bridges, commercial high-rises, and towering structures carefully calculated to withstand brutal hurricanes, massive earthquakes, and the crushing, inevitable weight of time. Throughout my entire career, I dealt exclusively in concrete facts, precise measurements, and undeniable truths. But nothing, absolutely nothing, in my 40 years of professional experience could have possibly prepared me for the complete and utter collapse of my own family. If you are just starting to watch this story now, I need you to pause for a moment and take a deep, steadying breath. What I am about to tell you is a dark, twisted nightmare that unfolded right under my nose, meticulously engineered by the very people I loved and trusted most in this world. I am talking about my wife Barbara and my own biological daughter Sarah. You spend your life building a history with someone. You share a bed, you raise a child, you pay off a mortgage together, and you truly believe you know every single corner of their soul. You think you understand the steady rhythm of their breathing and the hidden meaning behind every casual glance they give you across the dinner table. But sometimes the people we share our lives with are just wearing incredibly convincing masks, and when that mask finally slips, the monster underneath is entirely unrecognizable. It all began when they looked me dead in the eye and told me they were rushing out of town to care for Barbara's elderly parents. They said it was a life-or-death medical emergency, painting a picture of helpless old people in desperate need of their family. I stayed behind in our quiet Chicago home, nursing a bad knee from a recent replacement surgery. But guilt and paternal love are powerful driving forces. I could not just sit there in a warm house while my family suffered. I decided to make the grueling freezing drive up to their isolated snow-covered farmhouse in rural Wisconsin. I packed my truck with warm blankets, a massive bag of fresh groceries, over-the-counter medicine, and a beautiful bouquet of Barbara's favorite white winter lilies, just to show my unwavering support for my grieving wife. But when I finally arrived at that desolate, freezing property, the house was pitch black from the outside. There were no porch lights illuminating the snow, no signs of life, no evidence of a frantic medical emergency. I crept up to the side window, my boots crunching softly in the snow, and wiped away the thick layer of frost with my heavy gloved hand. And when I looked through that glass, the blood froze completely solid in my veins. It was a sight so twisted, so perfectly calculated and evil, that it shattered my 40 years of marriage in a single devastating heartbeat. I almost passed out right there in the snowbank, staring in pure horror at the unimaginable truth playing out inside. Before I pull back the curtain on this dark reality, please hit the like button to support an old man sharing his hardest, most painful chapter. Subscribe to the channel right now so you do not miss the rest of these life stories. And please tell me in the comments down below, what city are you watching this video from, and what time is it there right now? It truly brings a little light to my day, knowing exactly where you are, and knowing that I am not sitting alone in the dark. It all started 3 nights earlier, right around midnight, in our home in a wealthy, quiet suburb of Chicago. The house was usually perfectly still at that hour, wrapped in the kind of peaceful, comforting silence you only get after decades of an established routine. But that night, I was abruptly jolted awake by the heavy, frantic thud of footsteps echoing loudly down the hallway. A thump. I pushed myself out of bed, my right knee throbbing with the familiar dull ache from the replacement surgery I had undergone just a month prior. I limped toward the master suite's walk-in closet, turning on the light, and there was Barbara. She was frantically pulling expensive clothes from hangers and shoving them carelessly into 3 massive hard-shell suitcases. Her movements were erratic, jerky, and her breathing was shallow and incredibly fast. I stood in the doorway, rubbing my eyes, and asked her what in the world was going on at such an ungodly hour. She did not even stop packing to look at me. Her voice was trembling thick with what I honestly thought was genuine, terrifying panic. She told me that her parents, who were pushing 90 and lived on an isolated farm in Wisconsin, were in the middle of a terrible crisis. Her father had taken a severe fall down the wooden back steps and her mother was entirely bedridden, too weak to lift him, or even call for the right medical help in time. It sounded like an absolute catastrophe, the kind of midnight phone call every child dreads receiving. I immediately stepped forward and offered to pack a bag for myself. I told her I would drive her truck, that I could easily help lift her father off the floor, that we would face this frightening family emergency together, just like we had faced everything else over the last 4 decades. But Barbara stopped dead in her tracks, turned around, and placed her hands firmly on my chest, physically pushing me back toward the edge of the bed. She looked at me with wide, convincing, tear-filled eyes and told me absolutely not. She pointed to my knee, reminding me of my recent surgery, insisting that the 2-hour drive through the incoming blizzard and the icy, unplowed country roads would be far too dangerous for me. She said Sarah, our 38-year-old daughter, was already on her way over with her large SUV to pick her up. She begged me to stay home, rest my recovering leg, and let the two of them handle the heavy lifting and the hospital logistics. It sounded completely reasonable. It sounded exactly like a caring, devoted wife protecting her recovering husband from unnecessary physical strain. But then a few minutes later, I heard the heavy crunch of tires on the snowy driveway outside our bedroom window. I limped over to the glass and peered quietly through the wooden blinds. Sarah's black SUV was idling in the driveway, the thick exhaust billowing in the freezing night air. But it was not just Sarah sitting in the driver's seat. Her husband Jason, my son-in-law, was out there too, walking toward the back of the vehicle. As a retired structural engineer, my entire career, my entire way of thinking, was built on observing logistics, weight distribution, and functional processes. My brain is permanently wired to notice when a physical action does not match its supposed purpose. I watched closely as Jason opened the trunk of the SUV. He was not loading medical supplies, extra heavy blankets, or emergency first aid kits. Instead, he was dragging heavy black rectangular towers out of Sarah's sedan and transferring them into the larger vehicle. They were desktop computer servers, the heavy-duty kind, used for high-capacity commercial data processing, complete with thick bundles of tangled Ethernet cables and heavy power cords dragging through the snow. My brow furrowed in deep confusion. Why on earth would anyone bring enterprise-level computer servers to a rural farmhouse to deal with an elderly man who just fell down the stairs? Before my analytical mind could fully process that bizarre anomaly, Jason went back into the house and emerged lugging a heavy gray steel portable safe. I recognized it immediately, and my stomach dropped. It was the heavy fireproof lockbox Barbara kept hidden in the bottom drawer of her home office desk. Jason was visibly sweating, his breath pluming in the bitter cold air as he strained his back to heave the heavy steel box into the trunk of the SUV, wedging it right next to the computer servers. A cold, hard knot began to form in the very pit of my stomach. A medical emergency requires bandages, doctors, compassion, and comfort. It does not require high-capacity commercial data servers and a locked steel safe full of sensitive documents. I walked slowly downstairs to the grand foyer, just as Barbara was rushing out the front door, pulling her heavy winter coat tightly around her shoulders. I asked her one last time if she was absolutely sure she did not need me to come along. She kissed my cheek quickly, her lips feeling oddly cold, brief, and detached. She told me she loved me, promised to call me on my cell phone the absolute second the paramedics assessed her father's injuries, and rushed out into the blinding snow without a single backward glance. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind her, and the brass deadbolt clicked into place. Suddenly, our sprawling 4-bedroom house felt incredibly vast and suspiciously, suffocatingly empty. I stood entirely alone in the dark foyer, the silence pressing heavily against my ears. The logical, analytical part of my brain was screaming at me, waving bright red flags. The puzzle pieces they had just handed me were entirely the wrong shape. I waited in the kitchen for exactly 1 hour, watching the digital clock on the microwave tick away the seconds. Then I picked up the telephone and dialed the landline number for the Wisconsin farmhouse. I knew for a fact my in-laws kept that phone right next to their bed. If they were in the middle of a chaotic medical crisis, someone would be awake waiting by the phone, or paramedics would be moving around the house. The phone rang once. It rang twice. On the third long ring, the line connected. I opened my mouth to speak to ask if the ambulance had arrived safely. But before a single syllable could leave my lips, the receiver on the other end was abruptly picked up and then immediately forcefully slammed back down into the cradle. A harsh, aggressive click echoed loudly in my ear, followed by the hollow, mocking hum of a dead dial tone. There was no weak, trembling voice of an injured old man asking for help. There was no chaotic background noise of emergency responders. There was just the sharp, deliberate, undeniable action of someone intentionally and aggressively cutting off communication. I slowly lowered the phone back to the counter. The dull ache in my knee was entirely forgotten, completely replaced by a much sharper, much deeper pain radiating directly through my chest. My intuition, honed over 70 years of observing human behavior, was sounding a blaring, deafening alarm. They were not at that farm to care for sick grandparents. Something else was happening in the dark, something deeply wrong, and I swore to myself right then and there that I was going to find out exactly what it was. The most painful lesson I learned at 70 years old is that blood does not guarantee loyalty, and a familiar smiling face can easily hide the most calculating monster. We spend our entire lives building a fortress to protect our families from the outside world, only to realize too late that the real danger was already sitting right across from us at the dining room table. Never ignore your gut feeling, and never let your unconditional love blind you to the cold, hard facts right in front of your eyes. True strength isn't about maintaining the illusion of a perfect, unbroken family. It's about having the raw courage to tear down the fake facade and protect your own dignity, no matter how much the truth hurts. If my story resonated with you today, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to hear how I finally took my power back. Have you ever discovered a dark, unforgivable secret about someone you completely trusted with your life? Share your own experience in the comments below. Let me know what city you're watching from right now. It truly means the world to me. I stood perfectly still in the kitchen for a long time after that harsh click of the landline. The silence of the house pressed against my ears, feeling infinitely heavier than it had just a few minutes prior. My replacement knee throbbed with a dull, rhythmic pulse that matched the heavy beating of my heart. I tried desperately to convince my rational mind that it was just a simple mistake. Maybe Barbara had dropped the receiver in her blind panic. Maybe one of the rushing paramedics had accidentally knocked the phone off the wooden bedside table while rushing to stabilize her severely injured father. I poured myself a tall glass of cold tap water, drank it down in one gulp, and stared blankly out the window into the dark, swirling snow of the bitter Chicago winter. Sleep was now entirely out of the question. My mind, trained for decades to calculate load paths and identify invisible stress points, was already analyzing the structural integrity of my wife's frantic story, and the foundation was undeniably cracking under the weight of basic logic. I needed a distraction to calm my nerves, or perhaps I needed to find a specific phone number for the local county hospital situated near their Wisconsin farm. I left the dark kitchen and limped slowly down the long hallway toward the home office Barbara and I shared. I flicked on the brass desk lamp, casting a warm pool of yellow light across the green leather blotter. I genuinely thought I would just look through her personal address book to find a neighbor or a local doctor to call for a welfare check. I walked over to the heavy oak filing cabinet tucked in the far corner of the room. It was the secure cabinet where we meticulously kept all our most sensitive financial documents organized perfectly in alphabetical order over the span of our 40-year marriage. I grabbed the brass handle and pulled open the top drawer, fully expecting to see the familiar thick manila folders crammed with our extensive financial history. Instead, my hand met empty space. I pulled the heavy drawer out further, exposing the back. It was completely bare. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I quickly pulled open the second drawer, then the heavily weighted third drawer. Empty. Every single joint tax return from the last 15 years was completely gone. Our retirement investment portfolios, our banking ledgers gone. But what made my blood run absolutely cold was the bottom drawer. The specific reinforced green folder that securely held the original property deeds to our primary Chicago home and the Wisconsin farmhouse was completely missing. A frantic wife rushing out into a dangerous blizzard to tend to her bleeding broken father might accidentally pack mismatched socks or completely forget her toothbrush in the bathroom. She definitely does not take the calculated time to systematically empty a locked filing cabinet of property deeds and comprehensive financial records. That specific action requires cold, methodical premeditation. I stood there staring down into the empty wooden drawers, desperately trying to rationalize the gaping void in front of me. Perhaps she urgently needed specific medical insurance documents and blindly grabbed everything in a total panic. But a structural engineer fundamentally knows the stark difference between accidental chaos and deliberate, careful design. This was not a panic response. This was a systematic structural dismantling of our shared financial life. The unease blooming in my chest rapidly metastasized into a sharp, undeniable dread. I needed to hear a human voice. I needed someone to explain this bizarre void away, to give me a logical piece of data that would make this terrifying equation finally balance. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed my daughter, Sarah. The phone rang for what felt like an absolute eternity. With every piercing digital tone, my anxiety multiplied exponentially. Finally, the line connected. Sarah did not greet me with a standard, polite hello. She answered in a rushed, breathless whisper, sounding completely exhausted and emotionally overwhelmed. She told me she was so incredibly sorry they had not called me yet, but things were incredibly chaotic and terrifying at the farm. She said the rural paramedics had just left the property, and right now she and Barbara were desperately struggling to hook her grandfather up to an intravenous drip the emergency doctors had prescribed. She painted a vivid, agonizing picture of a dying man clinging weakly to life, telling me she was standing right outside his bedroom door so she would not disturb his fragile, critical rest. She asked me to please just go to sleep, promising they would update me first thing in the morning when the immediate medical crisis had safely passed. Her voice was an absolute masterclass in frantic filial devotion. But Sarah made one critical, catastrophic error in her performance. She completely forgot that my hearing is incredibly sharp, a vital necessity developed after years of listening for microscopic structural fractures on noisy, dangerous construction sites. Underneath her hushed, dramatic whisper, I clearly heard the ambient background noise. It was faint at first, but entirely unmistakable. It was definitely not the rhythmic, sterile beeping of a medical heart monitor, or the hushed, urgent tones of emergency healthcare providers working to save a life. I heard the bright, bouncy, upbeat tempo of a jazz saxophone playing smoothly from a high-quality surround sound system. Then came the crisp, clear sound of heavy crystal glasses clinking loudly against a glass bottleneck, the distinct, unmistakable pouring of an expensive liquid. And then cutting violently through Sarah's fabricated tragedy came a loud, booming burst of deep laughter. It was Jason. My son-in-law was laughing with the deep, relaxed, resonant belly laugh of a man enjoying a spectacular, carefree evening. The auditory evidence was absolute and unforgiving. You do not pour heavy drinks, play upbeat jazz music, and laugh uproariously while desperately struggling to insert a medical IV into a dying relative. I did not confront her right then and there. I simply told Sarah to take very good care of her family, wished her a quiet, peaceful night, and calmly ended the call. I lowered the phone slowly to my side, the phantom sound of the jazz music, and that mocking laughter still echoing loudly in my memory. They were not running a desperate medical triage up in that snow-covered farmhouse. They were hosting a lavish celebration, and they had deliberately, systematically left me behind in Chicago while they emptied my filing cabinets. The foundation of my reality was crumbling fast. I walked back into the silent hallway, my mind racing with terrifying possibilities. Every shadow in the empty house now felt like a warning. Every creak of the floorboards, a testament to the massive deception unfolding miles away. The cold dread pooling in my stomach solidified into an unyielding resolve. I knew I simply had to act incredibly fast. There was absolutely no time left to waste now. I was going to find out exactly what they were building, brick by deceptive brick, before it could crush me completely and ruin everything I had worked hard for today. I stood in the silent hallway for a few moments, letting the chill of the empty house settle into my bones. The grandfather clock in the living room chimed a hollow beat, a stark reminder of time slipping through my fingers. I needed to move. I needed to gather data. As a structural engineer, I knew that when a building begins to show stress fractures, you do not simply stare at the cracks and hope for the best. You pull blueprints, calculate load distribution, and follow the physical evidence down to the bedrock. I limped back into my study, my knee protesting with every step, and sat down at my heavy mahogany desk. I woke my laptop, the screen illuminating the dark room with a harsh, glaring white light. I was planning to check phone records to see if there had been any incoming calls from Wisconsin earlier. But before my browser could load, a notification chimed. It was an automated email alert from my primary banking institution marked with a red urgency flag. I opened the message, my eyes scanning the block of text. The bank was notifying me of a highly unusual out-of-state transaction that had just been processed on the premium joint credit card Barbara and I shared. The card was rarely used for anything other than our annual vacations or major household appliances. But tonight, at exactly 1:15 in the morning, a charge had been authorized for a staggering $15,000. My breath hitched in my throat. $15,000. It was a massive, sudden hemorrhage of funds. I leaned closer to the monitor, staring at the bold black numbers until they began to blur. A transaction of that magnitude processed in the middle of the night, immediately following a frantic, unexplained departure. The timing was entirely too precise to be a coincidence. I reached for my cell phone, my fingers feeling stiff and clumsy. I opened my text messages and typed out a quick direct message to Barbara. I asked her simply if she was aware of a massive charge on our joint account, hoping perhaps foolishly that there was a logical, innocent explanation for this sudden financial drain. I sat back in my leather chair watching the screen. I fully expected to wait hours for a reply. After all, she was supposed to be in the middle of a chaotic, life-threatening medical crisis with her parents. But the response came through almost instantaneously. The 3 small gray typing bubbles appeared on my screen just seconds after my message was delivered. Barbara replied with a long, detailed paragraph. She claimed that she and Sarah had arrived at the farm to find her parents in a state of absolute, total deterioration. She wrote that the situation was far worse than they had initially feared. According to her text, they had to urgently hire a specialized private 24-hour nursing service that demanded an immediate upfront retainer. She also claimed they needed to purchase an industrial-grade motorized medical bed and a series of oxygen monitors to stabilize her father. She ended the message by telling me not to worry, that she would handle all the confusing financial details, and begged me again to just go to sleep and rest my recovering knee. It was a flawless, highly emotional, and completely plausible lie. It was designed to trigger my empathy and shut down any further logical questioning. Most husbands would have read that message, felt a profound wave of relief that their competent wife was managing a terrible situation, and gone straight to bed. But I am not most husbands. I spent my entire professional life auditing construction materials, ensuring that every single bolt and steel beam met the exact rigid specifications of the building code. I know how to spot a structural weakness, and Barbara's story was entirely made of paper. I placed my phone face down on the desk. A legitimate medical supply company or a rural nursing agency would never process a $15,000 credit card transaction at 1:30 in the morning. Their billing departments would be closed. Moreover, acquiring a motorized medical bed in the middle of a blizzard in rural Wisconsin without prior arrangement was a logistical impossibility. The math simply did not add up. I turned my attention back to the glowing screen of my laptop. I logged directly into my secure banking portal, bypassing the summary page and diving straight into the detailed transaction ledgers. I needed the exact merchant identification code attached to that specific massive charge. I navigated through the labyrinth of banking menus until I found the pending authorization. I clicked on the merchant details, expanding the information box to reveal the destination of my $15,000. The name of the vendor was not a rural hospital, nor was it a local Midwestern medical supply warehouse. The transaction was processed by a company called Apex Integrated Solutions. I opened a new browser window and typed the company name into the search bar. I hit enter, waiting for the search engine to pull up the corporate profile. The results loaded instantly, and the truth hit me with the blunt, devastating force of a wrecking ball. Apex Integrated Solutions was a high-end, sophisticated corporate software firm based out of Silicon Valley. Their primary product, boldly advertised on their sleek, modern homepage, was advanced enterprise-level healthcare billing systems. They developed specialized automated software used by massive hospital networks to process thousands of insurance claims, manage complex patient databases, and route government Medicare payments. I sat frozen in my chair, the white light of the monitor reflecting in my wide, horrified eyes. Why in the world would my wife and daughter need commercial hospital-grade billing software to care for two dying grandparents in a secluded farmhouse? They would not. You do not purchase enterprise medical billing systems for personal family care. You purchase that kind of software when you are establishing a massive, highly lucrative healthcare business. The heavy desktop servers Jason was loading into the trunk suddenly made terrifying, absolute sense. The missing tax documents, the property deeds taken from my filing cabinet, the heavy safe loaded into the vehicle. They were not rushing to a medical emergency. They were relocating a corporate command center. They were setting up an intensive, highly organized financial operation in the middle of nowhere, perfectly shielded by a snowstorm and a fabricated family tragedy. The sheer scale of the deception began to unfold in my mind, expanding far beyond a simple marital lie. My wife and daughter were orchestrating a massive, complex fraud, and they were using my clean credit, my spotless reputation, and my hard-earned money to build the very foundation of their criminal enterprise. The jazz music and the laughter I had heard over the phone were not the sounds of a family comforting the sick. They were the sounds of absolute triumphant victory. They were celebrating the successful launch of their operation, confident that the clueless old man back in Chicago was fast asleep in his bed, completely ignorant of everything happening around him tonight. This changes everything. I sat perfectly still in the dim light of my home office. The bright glow of the laptop screen cast long, harsh shadows against the walls. The shocking revelation about the medical billing software hung heavy in the air like thick smoke. My mind struggled to process the sheer magnitude of this betrayal. In structural engineering, when a building shows sudden signs of catastrophic failure, you do not run away in fear. You dig deeper into the foundation until you find the exact point of collapse. I closed the browser tab for the software company and opened a highly secure window. I typed in the web address for our primary financial institution, the massive bank where Barbara and I banked. That institution held our entire life savings, our retirement funds, and the deed to our home. My fingers felt incredibly stiff over the keyboard, but my resolve was absolute. I entered my username and my password. The screen prompted me for an authentication code. My phone buzzed loudly on the desk. I typed in the 6 digits, hit enter, and watched the loading circle spin. The dashboard loaded, displaying our standard checking and savings accounts. At first glance, everything looked normal. The balances were exactly where they should be. But I knew better than to trust the surface layer. I clicked on the Advanced Account Management tab, a section I rarely visited. The page refreshed, and an entirely new section appeared. It was positioned at the very bottom of the screen. It was categorized under commercial holdings. My breath stopped completely in my chest. I dissolved my engineering firm 5 years ago when I retired. Yet there it was, a corporate sub-account active and linked directly to my primary profile. I clicked on the linked account, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. A drop-down menu appeared listing a series of attached digital documents. The title of the very first file made my stomach drop into a bottomless abyss. It read as a commercial line of credit authorization. I double-clicked the document, downloading a massive legal file. I scrolled past the dense, complex legal jargon quickly. My eyes were scanning intensely for the core financial figures. And then I saw it. The numbers leaped off the screen, bold and undeniable. $2,500,000. I blinked hard, shaking my head. I prayed that my tired eyes were playing a cruel trick on me. But the numbers did not change. $2.5 million. I scrolled down further to the collateral section. A loan of that massive size required substantial backing. There, listed in stark black and white text, was the primary asset securing this mountain of debt. It was the exact address of our home. The house I had paid off 20 years ago. The house where Barbara and I had lived. It was the house where we had raised our daughter. The house where I was currently sitting. They had completely leveraged my entire life to secure this commercial loan. My engineering background took over, suppressing the emotional devastation with cold, analytical logic. I needed to see the signatures. I needed to know exactly how they managed to bypass the bank's strict security protocols without my physical presence. I dragged the scroll bar to the final page of the contract. There, sitting on the designated guarantor line, was my signature. It looked absolutely perfect. The aggressive slant of the letters, the sharp, rigid angles, the exact pressure points I used when signing official blueprints. But it was definitely not legally real. It was a digital rendering, a flawless copy lifted from an old architectural permit and pasted onto this fraudulent loan application. I examined the document properties, searching for the hidden metadata. My eyes narrowed as I scanned the digital footprint attached to the electronic signature software. The bank automatically logs every internet protocol address used to finalize major commercial agreements. I copied the sequence of numbers and opened a network tracing tool I occasionally used for personal cybersecurity. The search results populated instantly. The address did not originate from my home office or Barbara's laptop. It was registered directly to a luxury apartment complex in downtown Chicago. It was registered to the exact building where my daughter Sarah currently lived. She lived there with her husband Jason. The betrayal sliced through me with the precision of a surgical scalpel. Sarah. My intelligent, tech-savvy daughter, who always bragged about her advanced computer coding skills. The daughter I had put through a prestigious university, paying every single tuition bill in cash, so she would never start her adult life in crushing debt. She had used those very skills to forge my digital identity, bypass the stringent banking security measures, and financially gut her own father. Barbara could never execute something this complex alone. She barely knew how to operate the television remote. This was a highly coordinated, meticulous conspiracy. Barbara provided the distraction, the emotional manipulation, and the physical theft entirely. She stole the deeds from my filing cabinet. Sarah provided the technological expertise, the digital forgery, and the corporate software acquisition. And Jason was the logistical muscle carrying the stolen servers. They ruthlessly stripped me of my financial independence, turning my pristine credit score into a massive weapon of debt. I was now on the hook for $2.5 million funding an enterprise software system I did not understand for a fake hospice operation I knew nothing about. If I defaulted on the payments, the bank would take my home and cast me out into the street. The urge to call Sarah was overwhelming. I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to demand immediate answers today. I wanted to hear her voice crack when she realized her computerized theft had been discovered by the old man she left behind. My trembling hand hovered over the cell phone resting on the heavy wooden desk. But the cold, calculating engineer inside me violently slammed the brakes on that emotional impulse. If I called her right now, I would lose my only tactical advantage. I would lose the element of absolute surprise. Sarah was incredibly smart. If she knew the security breach had been detected, she would not apologize. She would simply log into that commercial sub-account initiate a rapid series of complex electronic wire transfers, and move that money into offshore holding companies. They would vanish instantly. They would leave me holding a massive fraudulent debt, a stolen house, and an impending federal investigation. I could not confront them over the phone. I could not send a text message or an angry email. I had to trap them. I had to catch them in the exact moment of their triumph, surrounded by their stolen servers and fake billing networks. I needed physical evidence of their operation. I needed to see exactly what they were building in that isolated Wisconsin farmhouse. I needed to gather enough irrefutable proof to clear my own name and send all three of them to federal prison. The crushing weight of betrayal was replaced by a rigid determination. I powered down the laptop. The screen went black, plunging the home office back into the thick shadows of the early morning. I sat in the darkness for only a brief moment, letting the final traces of shock evaporate from my system. My heart was no longer racing. Instead, it beat with the slow, heavy, and methodical rhythm of a man who had just been handed the blueprints to his own execution and had decided to build a counter-offensive. I stood up from the heavy mahogany desk. My right knee immediately flared with a sharp, burning agony, a stark, painful reminder of the invasive surgery I had undergone just 4 weeks prior. I limped into the master bathroom and opened the mirrored medicine cabinet. The bright fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting a harsh glare on the small orange plastic bottle of prescription painkillers sitting on the top shelf. Barbara had been meticulously managing my medication schedule, handing me these pills every 4 hours with a warm, sympathetic smile. I took the bottle in my hand, feeling the cheap plastic rattle. If I took even a single dose, my mind would become clouded, slow, and compliant. That was exactly what she was counting on. Without a second of hesitation, I unscrewed the child-proof cap and dumped the entire contents directly into the small woven trash can next to the porcelain sink. I needed a mind as sharp as fractured glass. I needed the pain to keep me fully awake, sharply anchored to the undeniable reality of what my own family was doing to me. I moved into the walk-in closet and pulled down a heavy dark canvas duffel bag from the top shelf. I methodically packed a thick wool sweater, a pair of insulated waterproof trousers, heavy thermal socks, and my reinforced steel-toed construction boots. These were the exact same garments I used to wear when inspecting high-rise skeletal frames during the brutal, freezing Chicago winters. I was not packing for a gentle bedside vigil. I was equipping myself for a tactical infiltration. Every zipper I closed, every strap I pulled tight, felt like a deliberate step away from the man I was yesterday. I walked back downstairs, moving with a calculated precision that entirely ignored the screaming protests of my recovering joint. I grabbed my heavy winter coat, my leather work gloves, and the keys to my heavy-duty pickup truck. I opened the front door and stepped out into the freezing, turbulent night. The blizzard had already begun to blanket the wealthy suburban streets in a thick, suffocating layer of pristine white snow. The bitter wind bit into my cheeks, but the physical cold was absolutely nothing compared to the absolute zero temperature settling deep within my chest. I started the engine of my truck, listening to the deep, reliable rumble of the heavy block motor. I pulled out of the driveway, the tires crunching loudly against the fresh accumulation. My first stop was not the interstate highway leading north. I needed a flawless, impenetrable alibi. I needed physical props that would instantly disarm their defenses if I was caught approaching the farmhouse. I drove to a massive 24-hour supermarket located just off the main highway exchange. The bright, sterile aisles were almost completely deserted at this ungodly hour. I walked over to the floral department, my boots squeaking slightly on the polished linoleum floor. I carefully selected a large, extravagant bouquet of white winter lilies, the exact specific flower Barbara always claimed brought her peace during stressful times. I picked out a brightly colored mylar balloon with the words, "Get well soon," printed in cheerful, completely sickening, bubbly letters. I then walked over to the pharmacy aisle and placed several bottles of premium daily vitamins and organic immune support supplements into my plastic shopping basket. I walked to the checkout register and paid in cash. The young cashier looked at me with a soft, sympathetic smile, clearly seeing a devoted, worried husband rushing to the side of an ailing relative. I offered a polite, weary nod in return, expertly masking the absolute war zone raging behind my eyes. I placed the brightly colored props onto the passenger seat of my truck, perfectly arranged to look like a spontaneous, loving gesture from a naive, helpless old man. I pulled my truck onto the northbound interstate, merging into the dark, swirling chaos of the incoming blizzard. The highway was a treacherous ribbon of black ice and rapidly accumulating snowdrifts. The visibility was reduced to absolutely nothing beyond the hypnotic, swirling beams of my headlights. Most drivers would have pulled over entirely paralyzed by the dangerous, unpredictable conditions. But I had spent 40 years driving massive, heavily loaded trucks onto chaotic, unstable construction sites in the absolute worst weather the Midwest could possibly deliver. My hands gripped the steering wheel with a relaxed, permanent confidence. I knew exactly how to feel the traction slipping beneath the heavy tires, exactly how to feather the brakes to prevent a catastrophic spin, and exactly how to maintain a steady, relentless forward momentum when the rest of the world decided to stop. The dangerous, demanding drive required absolute physical focus, which provided a perfect, structured environment for my racing mind to systematically dismantle the last 3 years of my life. As the miles of dark, frozen highway disappeared beneath my wheels, I began to rigorously analyze the timeline of Barbara and the deep deception. I started sifting through the seemingly innocent events of the past, stripping away the lies to reveal the ugly, rusted framework underneath. Everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. 2 years ago, Barbara suddenly announced she was taking a highly involved leadership role in a regional charity organization. She claimed the group focused on organizing complex medical supply donations for impoverished overseas communities. It was the perfect, unimpeachable cover story. She used that fabricated charity work to justify spending countless hours locked inside our home office, aggressively organizing spreadsheets, taking hushed, urgent phone calls, and managing complex logistical networks. I had been so incredibly proud of her dedication, often bringing her cups of hot tea while she worked late into the night. I now realized she was not organizing medical donations. She was meticulously building the administrative foundation for a massive fraudulent healthcare billing network. She was establishing the corporate shells, learning the precise operational structures, and slowly stealing my financial identity right in front of my face. Then my thoughts shifted to Sarah. Just 14 months ago, my brilliant, technically gifted daughter abruptly quit her highly lucrative position at a legitimate software firm. She told me she was transitioning into a freelance career as an independent cybersecurity consultant, claiming she wanted freedom to choose ambitious projects. I fully supported her decision, offering to help fund her transition, completely oblivious to the fact that her new primary client was her mother. Her sudden career change was not a pursuit of professional independence. It was a calculated move to build the digital infrastructure for their fake commercial enterprise while fooling me. The drive ahead felt cold, dark, and wonderfully clear to me right now, setting the stage for absolute and total ruin. The journey off the highway. The rural roads of Wisconsin were a treacherous maze of packed ice and drifting snow. The blizzard had intensified, reducing visibility to a mere handful of feet. I navigated my heavy pickup truck with absolute precision, relying on decades of experience traversing dangerous construction sites in the dead of winter. My mind was singularly focused on the destination, shutting out the physical exhaustion that was beginning to set into my bones. As I neared the county road that led to my in-laws' property, I killed my headlights. I engaged the running lights, creeping forward at a literal crawl to minimize the deep rumbling sound of my engine. I knew I could not simply pull into the driveway. If Sarah and Barbara were running a sophisticated financial operation, they would undoubtedly have perimeter alerts, or simply spot the bright sweep of headlights against the dark snow-covered trees. I needed the element of absolute undetected surprise. I pulled my truck onto a narrow abandoned logging trail about half a mile down the road from the main farm entrance. I shifted into park, cut the engine, and sat in the sudden, deafening silence of the frozen wilderness. The heater ticked as it cooled down, leaving me alone with the howling wind outside and the heavy rhythmic thud of my own heartbeat. I zipped my heavy canvas winter coat up to my chin, pulled my insulated gloves on tight, and stepped out into the biting, brutal cold. The icy wind hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. The snow was already knee-deep, a pristine, untouched blanket of white that hid the uneven, treacherous ground below. Every single step required a monumental physical effort. I lifted my heavy steel-toed boots high, pushing through the drifts, my recent knee replacement, screaming in absolute fiery agony with every forced movement. But I did not stop. I could not stop. The burning pain in my joint was a necessary anchor, keeping me grounded and hyper-focused on the grim reality of my mission. I was a 70-year-old man marching through a midnight blizzard to uncover the complete betrayal of my own family. I forced my mind to detach from the physical suffering, employing the exact same mental discipline I used when inspecting high-altitude steel frameworks in sub-zero temperatures. I counted my steps, regulating my breathing to a steady, measured rhythm. The frozen trees offered a slight, meager protection against the howling wind as I systematically closed the distance to the property line. After 20 grueling minutes of exhausting physical exertion, the familiar outline of the old family farm finally began to materialize through the thick, swirling snow. I paused behind the thick trunk of a massive oak tree, my chest heaving, my breath pluming in thick, white clouds. I wiped the freezing moisture from my eyes and carefully surveyed the perimeter. The first glaring anomaly presented itself immediately. The large wrought iron main gate, which usually stood wide open to welcome family and friends, was pulled tightly shut. I crept closer, staying low, using the snowdrifts for cover. Woven through the heavy iron bars was a thick, industrial-grade steel chain secured by a massive high-security padlock. It was the exact type of heavy-duty lock we used to secure highly sensitive, multi-million-dollar construction sites. It was certainly not the kind of cheap, standard hardware an elderly farming couple would use to secure their driveway. I traced the deep, fresh tire tracks leading up to the heavy gate. There were absolutely no wide, dual wheel treads that would indicate a heavy ambulance or a commercial medical transport van. There were no small standard vehicle tracks that a local visiting nurse or a rural hospice care worker might drive. The narrative of a frantic life or death medical emergency was crumbling rapidly before my very eyes. I moved cautiously along the wooden perimeter fence, my boots sinking silently into the deep snow. I headed toward the large, dilapidated wooden barn situated 50 yards from the main house. In the past, that drafty structure had housed nothing but old, rusting tractors, broken agricultural equipment, and piles of rotting, forgotten firewood. But as I carefully approached the large sliding doors, I noticed they had been strongly reinforced. The old, rotting wood had been backed with solid steel paneling. I found a narrow, vertical gap between the heavy sliding doors and pressed my face against the frozen wood, peering into the pitch-black interior. My eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, and the shape of the shadows began to form solid, undeniable outlines. There was no farm equipment inside. Instead, parked in perfect, meticulous alignment, were 3 brand-new, top-of-the-line luxury utility vehicles. Their sleek, polished metallic surfaces gleamed faintly in the ambient darkness. They were massive, aggressive machines, completely out of place in this rural, impoverished county. I recognized Sarah's black vehicle, and next to it 2 identical high-performance imported models that easily cost over $100,000 each. This was the undeniable physical manifestation of the stolen wealth. This was the commercial loan stripped from the equity of my home and converted into aggressive, tangible assets. I pulled away from the barn doors, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. The sheer audacious greed of it all was completely staggering. I turned my attention to the main farmhouse, a structure I knew intimately, because I had personally reinforced the foundation 20 years ago. But the building standing in front of me now was fundamentally altered. Every single window on the first and second floors was completely blacked out. They had not just drawn the curtains. They had installed thick, opaque privacy screens, the kind used in secure corporate facilities, to prevent any visual or thermal observation from the outside. Not a single sliver of light escaped the structure. It looked like a dark, impenetrable fortress sitting in the middle of the frozen wasteland. I crept closer, moving silently from tree to tree, evaluating the structure with the cold, critical eye of a professional engineer. That is when I saw the true extent of their deep paranoia. Mounted high under the wooden eaves of the wraparound porch were sleek, modern, commercial-grade security cameras. They were not standard motion-activated home security devices. They were high-definition, low-light, continuous recording lenses, equipped with advanced infrared sensors. I tracked their precise placement along the long roofline. Whoever installed them understood overlapping visual fields. There were absolutely no blind spots. Every single angle of approach to the front door, the driveway, and the rear patio was perfectly covered by a redundant cross-referencing camera network. I pressed my back against the frozen bark of a large pine tree, calculating the viewing angles. They had transformed a simple, welcoming family home into a highly secured, heavily monitored compound. You do not install commercial perimeter defense systems to protect a dying old man from a fall. You install these extreme, expensive measures to protect a highly illegal, incredibly lucrative criminal operation. I was now completely, entirely locked out. Or so they confidently believed. A standard intruder or even a local police officer responding to a noise complaint would have looked at that overlapping camera network and immediately turned back toward the main road. The security was professionally designed to funnel any approach directly into the glaring spotlight of their high-definition lenses. But I was not a standard intruder. I was the structural engineer who had spent 6 back-breaking weeks in the summer of 2004 reinforcing the crumbling limestone foundation of this exact farmhouse. I knew the bones of this building better than I knew the back of my own hand. And I knew about a massive, glaring vulnerability that no modern security contractor would ever think to look for simply because it was not listed on any recent county blueprints. On the north side of the property, hidden completely behind a thick, overgrown row of massive evergreen bushes, lay the original root cellar entrance. It was a heavy, rusted iron grate set flush into the ground, leading to a forgotten sub-basement that had been sealed off from the main house during a crude renovation decades before I ever entered the picture. When I poured the new concrete footings, I had explicitly left that old cellar shaft intact, capping it with a heavy steel hatch from the inside, intending to eventually convert the space into a storm shelter. That project was completely abandoned, and the iron grate was left to vanish beneath years of falling pine needles and creeping ivy. I began to move, circling far wide of the camera angles, using the howling blizzard and the thick tree line to mask my slow, agonizing progress. The snow was drifting higher on the north elevation, piling heavily against the side of the wooden porch. Every step sent a fresh, blinding wave of fiery pain shooting upward from my surgically repaired knee. My breath hitched in my throat, freezing instantly in the bitter air. I dropped down onto my hands and knees in the deep snow, ignoring the freezing moisture seeping through my heavy canvas trousers. I crawled behind the dense wall of evergreen bushes, my leather work gloves scraping blindly against the frozen earth. I swept away thick layers of snow, ice, and dead vegetation, my fingers numb and clumsy. Finally, the hard, unforgiving texture of rusted iron met my palms. I brushed the remaining snow aside, revealing the old cellar grate. It was locked down by decades of rust and neglect. I reached into the deep pocket of my heavy winter coat and pulled out a solid steel pry bar I had grabbed from my truck. I wedged the flattened edge of the tool under the lip of the heavy iron grate, positioning my body for maximum leverage. I pushed down with all my remaining upper body strength, gritting my teeth against the terrible, sickening pop that echoed in my bad knee. For a long, terrifying moment, the rusted iron refused to budge. Then, with a harsh metallic screech that was instantly swallowed by the roaring blizzard wind, the heavy grate broke free from the frozen earth. I heaved it upward, flipping it over into the deep snow. A wave of stale, musty air rushed up from the pitch-black square hole, smelling intensely of damp earth and forgotten decades. I lowered my legs into the narrow vertical shaft, feeling blindly for the crumbling stone steps. The descent was pure physical torture. My rigid, swollen joint screamed in absolute protest as I forced it to bear my entire body weight in the cramped freezing space. I slipped through the opening, pulling the heavy iron grate back down over my head to conceal my point of entry. The sudden transition from the howling, chaotic blizzard to the dead, suffocating silence of the forgotten sub-basement was incredibly jarring. I stood in the absolute pitch-black darkness, giving my eyes a long moment to adjust. The air down here was incredibly cold, thick, with the heavy scent of mildew and wet stone. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone, lowering the screen brightness to its absolute minimum setting before turning it on. The faint, glowing light illuminated the rough, uneven limestone walls and the dirt floor of the old cellar. I limped slowly toward the far end of the underground chamber, navigating around rotting wooden support beams and piles of crumbling debris. My target was a specific structural point. Directly above the far corner of this isolated room was an old original floor vent that connected straight into the main living room of the farmhouse. It had been covered over with heavy oak flooring during a cosmetic update, but the acoustic hollow still remained perfectly intact. It was an unintentional architectural listening tube. I reached the corner and leaned my shoulders heavily against the cold stone wall, trying desperately to catch my breath. I unlocked my phone, opened the default voice recording application, and pressed the red circular button to begin capturing audio. I placed the device carefully onto a high, protruding wooden ledge directly beneath the acoustic hollow. The heavy oak floorboards directly above my head creaked loudly, protesting under the sudden shift of human weight. Footsteps. Distinct, confident, and entirely unhurried footsteps were moving across the room above me. I held my breath, freezing perfectly in place, straining my ears to capture every single vibration filtering down through the old wooden floor. First, there was the heavy rhythmic thud of a man walking in expensive leather shoes. Jason. Then the lighter, faster click of a woman walking quickly across the room. The acoustics of the old house amplified the sounds, funneling them down the hidden vent shaft and directly into my waiting microphone. Then came a sound that absolutely shattered any remaining desperate illusion I might have been clinging to. It was a sharp, crisp, unmistakable sound, the loud, celebratory pop of a heavy champagne cork. The pop was immediately followed by a chorus of bright, unrestrained laughter. It was Sarah laughing with a light, joyous melody I had not heard from her in years. A deep, resonant chuckle joined in, belonging to Jason. Then a third voice spoke. It was Barbara. My wife of 40 years, the woman who was supposedly weeping over the shattered bodies of her dying parents, was speaking in a crisp, clear, and completely relaxed tone. She was asking Jason to pour the drinks to the absolute brim, declaring that tonight was the official beginning of their brand new life. I stood in the freezing, damp darkness of the root cellar, listening to my family celebrate my absolute financial execution. My phone continued to record every single damning syllable, capturing the undeniable, audible proof of their massive, coordinated conspiracy. I heard the distinct clinking of fine crystal glasses touching together in a celebratory toast. Every single piece of their lie was captured forever on audio. They were toasting to my absolute and permanent downfall, completely unaware that I was standing quietly, just a few feet directly below them, secretly recording their entire criminal confession perfectly in the dark. The recording on my phone captured their laughter, but I needed visual confirmation to absolutely seal their fate. I slipped my phone back into my heavy winter coat and turned toward the narrow wooden staircase that led from the old root cellar directly up to the main floor. The stairs had not been used in decades. They were steep, narrow, and structurally compromised by years of damp decay. I gripped the rough stone wall for balance and began my ascent. Every upward step required me to bend my recovering knee past its comfortable limit, sending fresh spikes of agonizing pain up my thigh. I placed my steel-toed boots on the extreme outer edges of the wooden treads, applying my weight gradually to avoid the loud, betraying creak of old timber. The thick, dusty air of the cellar slowly gave way to the crisp, climate-controlled atmosphere of the house above. I reached the top of the stairs, stopping just behind the heavy wooden door that separated the hidden shaft from the main living area. The door was slightly ajar, leaving a vertical sliver of bright artificial light cutting through the darkness of the stairwell. I leaned in close, pressing my right eye to the narrow gap, completely holding my breath. The sight that greeted me absolutely shattered my understanding of reality. The warm, rustic farmhouse living room I remembered from 20 years ago had been completely and ruthlessly eradicated. The floral sofas, the hand-knit rugs, and the antique wooden coffee tables were entirely gone. In their place stood a cold, sterile, high-technology command center that looked like it belonged in a Silicon Valley corporate park. The original hardwood floors were covered with thick black industrial cables snaking aggressively across the room like thick plastic veins. Against the far wall, where a beautiful stone fireplace used to sit, 3 massive black server racks now hummed with relentless efficiency. Green and blue light-emitting diodes blinked rapidly on their sleek digital faces, processing an absolute mountain of fraudulent data. The rhythmic mechanical whir of heavy cooling fans entirely masked the sound of the raging blizzard outside. I shifted my gaze to the center of the room. A massive custom-built conference table dominated the space, completely buried under a chaotic sea of glowing computer monitors, expensive laptop stations, and towering stacks of printed legal documents. But the most damning evidence was plastered across a series of large white dry erase boards mounted directly over the floral wallpaper. I squinted through the narrow gap, my engineering mind rapidly processing the raw data written in Sarah's precise, aggressive handwriting. The whiteboards were not covered in business strategies or legitimate software development plans. They were covered in stolen human lives. I saw hundreds of names categorized by age and medical vulnerability. Next to every single name was a corresponding social security number, a date of birth, and a detailed, highly specific medical history. The board to the far left was titled Apex Solutions Billing Cycles, completely confirming the $15,000 credit card charge I had traced earlier. Below that title was a meticulous, highly organized payout schedule, detailing massive recurring government Medicare reimbursements for complex high-level hospice care. They were creating phantom patients, using stolen identities to bill the federal government for expensive specialized medical equipment and 24-hour nursing services that simply did not exist. They were bleeding the system dry, funneling millions of dollars into their newly established corporate shells. I moved my line of sight toward the kitchen archway, finally laying eyes on the architects of this massive financial conspiracy. Jason, Sarah, and Barbara were standing around the granite kitchen island, basking in the warm golden glow of the overhead pendant lights. They looked absolutely nothing like a family deep in the throes of a tragic medical crisis. Sarah was wearing a sharp, expensive designer blazer, looking every bit the ruthless corporate executive she had secretly become. She was holding a sleek tablet in her left hand, casually swiping through screens of stolen data while she sipped from a delicate crystal champagne flute. Jason stood beside her, his tie loosened, a smug, completely satisfied grin plastered across his face. He leaned casually against the counter, pouring more expensive champagne from a green bottle. And then I looked at Barbara, my wife, the woman I had spent 4 decades loving, protecting, and trusting with my entire life. She was not crying. She was not panicked. Her face was flushed with the absolute thrill of victory. She was wearing a comfortable, elegant cashmere sweater, holding her glass up to the light, laughing warmly at something Jason had just said. There was absolutely no trace of the frantic, terrified woman who had called me in a blind panic just a few hours ago. Her emotional breakdown on the phone had been an absolute masterclass in theatrical deception, a flawless performance designed specifically to manipulate my protective instincts and keep me firmly planted in Chicago while they executed the final, most dangerous phase of their operation. I stood frozen in this dark stairwell, watching them celebrate their massive, fraudulent triumph. They were so incredibly confident in their airtight deception. They truly believed they had accounted for every single variable. They believed the blizzard would keep anyone from approaching the farm. They believed the heavy privacy curtains would hide their glowing monitors from the outside world. They believed their complex security cameras would detect any unexpected intrusion. And above all else, they believed I was a foolish, trusting, completely naive old man who would simply sit at home and wait patiently for an update. But as I watched them clink their glasses together in a toast to their stolen wealth, a sudden chilling realization hit me, a detail so glaringly obvious that it nearly made my heart stop beating. I frantically scanned the visible portions of the living room, the kitchen, and the open hallway leading to the ground floor bedrooms. The house was entirely dominated by servers' cables, whiteboards, and computers. There was absolutely no medical equipment anywhere in sight. There was no industrial-grade motorized medical bed. There were no oxygen tanks, no heart monitors, no sterile intravenous drip stands. The entire environment was a sterile, cold, digital processing center. The constant mechanical hum of the computer cooling fans was the only sound vibrating through the floorboards. I strained my ears, listening intently for the rhythmic, desperate breathing of a dying man. I listened for the soft, frail voice of an elderly woman calling out for a nurse. But underneath the cheerful laughter and the clinking glasses of my treacherous family, the house was completely, utterly silent. The narrative Barbara had spun was that her parents were upstairs clinging to life surrounded by private emergency nurses. But there were no nurses here. There was no medical triage. The realization crashed over me like a wave of freezing water. Where were the grandparents? Where were Barbara's parents? If they were not here fighting for their lives in a makeshift medical ward, then where exactly were they? Had they ever been here at all? Were they safely hidden away in some assisted living facility, completely unaware that their own daughter was using their identities as the emotional cover story for a massive federal crime? Or was the reality something much darker? Had they passed away months ago, and Barbara had simply kept their deaths a secret, quietly maintaining their property and their accounts to build this exact, perfect staging ground for their fraud? The missing grandparents were the final terrifying piece of this catastrophic puzzle. Their absence fundamentally shifted the reality of the situation from a massive financial deception to something infinitely more sinister. If my wife was capable of using her own parents' mortality as a convenient disposable pawn in a multi-million-dollar Medicare scam, then there was absolutely no limit to her depravity. She was not just a thief, she was a complete remorseless sociopath. I stood in the darkness, my hand tightly gripping the rusted iron handle of the cellar door. The urge to burst into the room and confront them face to face was nearly blinding. I wanted to tear down their whiteboards, smash their expensive servers, and demand to know the exact truth about everything. But I knew that walking through that door right now would be a critical, fatal error. They were 3 against 1. They were ruthless, they were desperate, and they had millions of dollars riding on my silence. If I revealed myself before I had completely secured all of the necessary evidence, I would never make it out of this frozen farmhouse alive. I needed to move deeper into the shadows. I needed to find out exactly what happened to the grandparents before I burned this entire criminal empire straight to the ground. My hand remained locked around the freezing iron handle of the cellar door. The metallic chill seeped through my heavy leather glove, grounding my racing thoughts. I knew I could not simply wait in the shadows of the stairwell forever. I needed absolute confirmation regarding the fate of the 2 elderly people whose property had been hijacked for this massive corporate crime. I leaned my weight carefully against the heavy wooden frame and applied a microscopic amount of pressure. The ancient brass hinges let out a faint, nearly imperceptible groan as the door swung open just 2 inches further. This new expanded angle granted me a clear, unobstructed line of sight straight through the modern kitchen and directly into the adjacent formal dining room. The space was dimly lit by a single harsh fluorescent bulb, casting a sickly pale yellow glow over the scene. What I saw in that room instantly paralyzed my lungs and turned the blood in my veins to absolute ice. The large antique oak dining table had been forcefully pushed against the far wall, treated like worthless debris. In its place, positioned dead center under the glaring light, were two massive clinical reclining medical chairs. They were covered in cheap, sterile blue vinyl, contrasting violently with the warm, rustic aesthetic of the old farmhouse. Sitting in those chairs were her parents, but they were not resting comfortably, nor were they receiving compassionate end-of-life care. They were restrained. Thick, heavy nylon straps crisscrossed over their frail chests and waists, securing them tightly to the rigid frames of the recliners. The straps were pulled tight enough to restrict any meaningful movement, completely pinning the two elderly people in a state of absolute forced submission. My eyes darted to their wrists, discovering smaller, heavily padded cuffs locking their fragile arms to the metal armrests. This was not a medical sanctuary. This was a crude, makeshift prison cell designed for total physical control. I pressed my face closer to the narrow wooden gap, my heart hammering a frantic, sickening rhythm against my ribs. I stared at my father-in-law, a man who had spent his entire life working the unforgiving Wisconsin soil with fierce, unyielding pride. His head was slumped heavily against his left shoulder, lolling at an unnatural, deeply uncomfortable angle. His eyes were wide open, but they were entirely devoid of any human recognition or cognitive spark. They were glassy, vacant, and completely unfocused, staring blankly at the blank wall with the vacant gaze of a hollow shell. A thick string of saliva pooled at the corner of his slack, open mouth, dripping slowly down his chin and soaking the collar of his faded flannel shirt. He did not blink. He did not twitch. He did not attempt to swallow. He was physically present, but his mind had been entirely erased. Beside him, my mother-in-law mirrored his devastating condition. Her silver hair, which she had always kept meticulously styled, hung in lank, greasy strands across her pale, sunken face. Her breathing was dangerously shallow, a slow, rattling wheeze that barely moved the heavy nylon straps securing her frail chest. Her hands lay completely limp within the padded wrist cuffs, the fingers curled inward like dead, decaying leaves. As a structural engineer, I understand the mechanics of physical failure. I have seen materials buckle under pressure, and I have seen biological systems shut down from age and natural disease. But the catastrophic deterioration of these two human beings was definitively not natural. They were not actively dying from an underlying terminal illness. They were being aggressively, intentionally kept in a state of deep, unnatural chemical suspension. They were heavily drugged. My sharp eyes quickly scanned the sterile perimeter surrounding the two medical recliners. A small stainless steel rolling cart sat positioned between the two chairs. On the top tray rested a chaotic collection of medical supplies that absolutely confirmed my darkest, most terrifying suspicions. There were multiple open boxes of large-gauge syringes, thick rubber tourniquets, and dozens of small, empty glass vials scattered across the metal surface. The labels on the discarded vials were partially visible under the harsh fluorescent light. They were heavy, unprescribed veterinary-grade tranquilizers and powerful chemical sedatives. These were not gentle pain management medications administered by a certified, compassionate hospice nurse. These were industrial-strength chemical restraints meant to induce absolute unconsciousness and total paralysis. My wife was systematically injecting her own parents with massive doses of unregulated narcotics just to keep them quiet and compliant. The sheer, unadulterated evil of the situation washed over me completely, suffocating my ability to draw a full breath. Barbara had weaponized their incredibly fragile mortality. She had essentially turned her own mother and father into silent, living props. They were nothing more than biological placeholders, warm bodies required to legitimize the massive fraudulent Medicare claims Sarah was actively submitting through those humming black servers in the living room. whenever an insurance auditor required a physical check or a digital verification of life. Barbara simply wheeled a camera into the dining room, pointed the lens at her sedated, drooling parents, and secured another $1 million payout. She was milking the federal government dry, and she was using the chemically induced comas of the people who gave her life as the fundamental building blocks of her criminal empire. The cruelty was absolutely absolute. I looked back toward the bright kitchen archway, listening to the joyful, celebratory laughter bubbling from the throats of my family. I heard her voice clearly sweet and maternal as she offered Jason another slice of celebratory cake. A profound, nauseating wave of physical sickness twisted violently in my stomach. The woman I had slept next to for 4 decades was a complete and utter monster. The gentle, caring persona she had worn for her entire life was a flawless, terrifying mask. Beneath that warm exterior lived a cold, calculating sociopath who could casually inject her elderly parents with horse tranquilizers, strap them to vinyl chairs, and then walk into the next room to drink expensive champagne and laugh with her son-in-law. Every single memory I held of our marriage instantly became completely tainted, painted over with the dark, heavy brush of this horrifying reality. I stood frozen in the cold shadows of the basement stairwell, staring at the tragic chemical imprisonment of 2 helpless seniors. The massive corporate fraud involving my stolen identity, the fake tax returns, and the $2 million commercial loan against my Chicago home suddenly felt completely insignificant. Financial crimes could be litigated, investigated, and ultimately reversed through the strict mechanics of the legal system. But this level of calculated predatory abuse was entirely unforgivable. They were torturing vulnerable people for profit. My engineering mind locked firmly into a state of absolute, unyielding resolve. I did not just need evidence of their corporate theft anymore. I needed to gather indisputable, irrefutable proof of this agonizing medical torture. I needed to carefully document every single needle, every heavy nylon strap, every forged medical document, and every stolen breath completely, meticulously, and absolutely perfectly today before they could realize they had been watched by me. I tore my gaze away from the horrifying tableau in the dining room and pressed my ear closer to the narrow gap in the wooden floorboards. The damp air of the root cellar clung to my skin, but a different kind of chill was settling deep within my bones. I reached into my coat pocket to verify that my phone was still capturing every single sound, its digital timer ticking away in the darkness, quietly documenting the absolute destruction of my family. Above me, the sickening sounds of celebration continued unabated. I could hear the sharp clinking of crystal flutes and the rich, arrogant tone of my son-in-law echoing against the old plaster walls. Jason was holding court in what used to be the family living room. His voice was loud, booming with the unearned confidence of a man who believed he had just pulled off the perfect, untraceable crime. He began to boast, his words tumbling out in a rapid, excited cadence as he paced across the heavy industrial cables covering the hardwood floor. He proudly detailed the sheer brilliance of the $2.5 million commercial loan he had successfully secured against my property in Chicago. Listening to him speak, I realized just how deeply he had researched my financial history. He bragged to Sarah and Barbara about bypassing the strict lending parameters by utilizing my decades of immaculate credit history and the sterling reputation of my engineering firm to fast-track the massive approval process. Jason explained that the funds were instantly funneled into a network of newly registered corporate accounts, providing the massive initial seed money required to launch their operation. He raised his voice clearly, addressing my wife, and complimented her for convincing me to stay out of the family finances for the past few years. He called the Wisconsin farm the absolute perfect front. According to his loud, arrogant explanation, they had officially registered the rural property as an exclusive high-tier hospice care facility. By isolating the operation out here in the frozen Midwest, far away from any major metropolitan regulatory oversight, they had created a ghost clinic. He gleefully recounted how they were actively submitting thousands of fraudulent claims to the federal government, billing Medicare for phantom patients, non-existent 24-hour nursing services, and incredibly expensive specialized medical equipment that had never once entered the building. The sheer scale of the theft was staggering, an intricate web of digital lies woven together by unparalleled greed. Barbara chimed in, her voice completely devoid of any natural maternal warmth or basic human empathy. She happily agreed with Jason, noting how incredibly simple it had been to use her own heavily sedated parents to legitimize the entire fraudulent front. She spoke about them not as human beings, not as the parents who had raised and loved her, but as convenient biological props. She explained that whenever a remote auditor required visual verification for their massive billing claims, she simply propped her unconscious father up in his medical chair, adjusted the lighting, and conducted a brief video call. She laughed a light, airy laugh, stating that the government representatives were always so incredibly sympathetic to her fabricated plight that they approved the million-dollar payouts without a second glance. I gripped the rusted iron handle of the cellar door so tightly my knuckles ached, my structural engineering mind struggling to comprehend how my own wife could engineer such a catastrophic moral collapse. I had spent 40 years building safe, secure foundations for people to live upon, and the woman I loved was actively dismantling the lives of her own parents for a stream of illicit government cash. The utter depravity of their conversation flowed down through the floorboards like a toxic river, drowning every single fond memory I had ever held of my family. But the most devastating blow was yet to come. The rhythmic clicking of Sarah's expensive heels paused directly above my head. The room grew slightly quieter as she took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne. When my daughter finally spoke, the cold, analytical edge in her voice sounded completely foreign to me. She was no longer the bright, compassionate girl I had proudly sent off to university. She had mutated into a ruthless, calculating architect of corporate fraud. Sarah let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut straight through the heavy floorboards and pierced my heart with agonizing precision. She told Jason and Barbara that the massive government payouts were certainly fantastic, but the absolute best part of their entire operation was the structural failsafe she had personally designed. Her voice dripped with arrogant satisfaction as she explained the intricate digital paper trail she had meticulously coded. She stated very clearly that if the federal authorities ever detected the anomalies in the Medicare billing cycle and launched a comprehensive investigation into the ghost clinic, the three of them were completely shielded from any legal blowback. She had explicitly listed my Pristine Engineering Limited Liability Company as the primary guarantor for the massive commercial loan and the overarching corporate structure of the hospice facility. Sarah laughed again, a sound so devoid of basic humanity that it made me physically nauseous. She explained that she had purposefully routed the initial seed money through my business accounts before transferring it to the farm. She boasted that the federal investigators would follow the digital footprints, and every single piece of financial evidence would trace the illegal seed money right back to the clueless old man sitting in Chicago. She was eagerly, proudly explaining how she had designated her own father as the ultimate, unavoidable fall guy. She assured her mother and her husband that when the entire fraudulent empire inevitably collapsed under the weight of a federal audit, I would be the one facing decades in a federal penitentiary, while they would be safely living overseas on the untraceable millions she had successfully routed through offshore accounts. I completely stopped breathing entirely. The heavy, damp air of the root cellar felt like solid concrete against my chest. I had spent the last several hours desperately clinging to the faint, irrational hope that my daughter had somehow been manipulated into this scheme, that Jason was the sole mastermind, twisting her technical skills for his own dark purposes. But hearing the sheer, unapologetic malice in her voice completely eradicated that comforting illusion. Sarah was not a victim. She was the absolute center of this conspiracy. She had deliberately engineered my complete financial and legal destruction with the exact same meticulous precision I used to draft architectural blueprints. She viewed my life, my freedom, and my spotless reputation as nothing more than disposable building materials for her own criminal success. The profound, agonizing grief that had been welling up inside my throat suddenly vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, absolute, and unyielding rage. They truly believed I was a relic of the past, a slow, trusting fool who would simply roll over and accept his predetermined fate. They believed they had accounted for every structural variable in their complex criminal design. But they had made one catastrophic miscalculation. They forgot my intelligence. I pressed my heavy-gloved hands flat against the rough stone wall of the root cellar to steady myself. The pain in my knee was eclipsed by the icy dread flooding my veins. Through the narrow gap in the floorboards above the golden light of the kitchen cast long shadows across the ceiling. I watched the three of them moving with the relaxed grace of people who had already won. Jason leaned over the granite island, pouring champagne into their crystal flutes. The cheerful clinking of delicate glass echoed down the wooden shaft, a sound so entirely normal that it violently contrasted with the magnitude of their crimes. Sarah was smiling, her eyes fixed on the screen of her tablet, scrolling through fraudulent patient manifests that were siphoning millions into offshore accounts. I waited in the dark, my phone positioned on the wooden ledge, capturing every vibration of their triumph. Then Barbara stepped fully into my narrow line of sight. She set her empty flute down on the marble counter and picked up a large goblet of dark red wine. She held it by the stem, gently swirling the crimson liquid, watching the thick trails cling to the glass. Her face was relaxed, her posture completely at ease. She took a slow sip, letting the silence stretch for a brief moment before she spoke. Her voice was not raised. It was not angry. It was smooth, conversational, and utterly terrifying in its calm detachment. She looked at Jason and Sarah, offering them a warm smile before delivering a statement that would haunt my nightmares forever. "If the Department of Health audits this place next month," she said, her tone as casual as if she were discussing the local weather forecast, "we will already be safely in Geneva. William will be left holding the bag." She paused, taking another slow sip of her wine, savoring the expensive taste. She let out a soft, contented sigh before continuing her explanation. "With his worsening memory, that I have been meticulously laying the groundwork for with his doctors over the past year, he will not even know how to mount a defense. He will either go straight to federal prison for organizing a massive fraud, or a judge will toss him into a psychiatric ward for his protection. Either way, we win." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. I stopped breathing. The damp basement air suddenly felt too thick to inhale. My mind violently rewound the events of the past 14 months, filtering them through this new lens. Suddenly, 100 tiny moments made brutal sense. I remembered the misplaced car keys and missing files. I remembered the times I had sworn I placed a document in a specific drawer, only for Barbara to find it in the kitchen, offering me a look of deep concern. I remembered the hushed phone calls she made to our doctor, claiming she was asking for advice on how to handle an aging husband who was becoming confused. She had not been caring for me. She had been systematically, deliberately gaslighting me. She was actively building a documented medical history of severe cognitive decline. She had been planting the seeds of dementia in my records, so that when federal investigators inevitably stormed my home in Chicago, looking for the mastermind behind this massive criminal syndicate, they would find exactly what they were meant to find. They would find a confused old man losing his grip on reality. No jury would ever believe my desperate protests of innocence. They would look at the digital signatures the limited liability company registered in my name, the millions routed through my personal accounts, and they would look at my compromised medical file. Barbara was entirely right. I would either die in a federal penitentiary, completely stripped of my legacy, or I would spend my final years locked inside a sterile psychiatric facility, heavily medicated and completely ignored. The sheer magnitude of their cruelty was absolutely staggering. They did not just want to steal my wealth. They needed to completely eradicate my credibility to protect themselves. They needed me to become the perfect, tragic scapegoat. My gaze shifted back toward the dining room where her parents sat strapped to those vinyl medical recliners, drooling and heavily sedated on industrial tranquilizers. I realized with absolute clarity that Barbara intended to leave them behind as well. When federal agents finally raided this farmhouse, they would not find the architects of the fraud. They would find a fake clinic, two drugged victims of horrific elder abuse, and a digital paper trail leading directly to my doorstep. Sarah, Jason, and Barbara would be sitting in a luxury suite in Switzerland, living off the millions they had washed through my name. The timeline of my survival was shrinking rapidly. The impending Department of Health audit that Barbara casually mentioned was a massive, terrifying ticking clock. It was no longer a matter of simply gathering evidence to prove financial theft. I was now fighting against a rapidly closing window of time. I had a matter of weeks, perhaps only days, before the federal government uncovered the anomalies in the hospice billing cycle and dispatched armed agents to my front door. If I hesitated for even a single moment, the trap my own family had built would snap shut around me permanently. I pulled my cell phone down from the wooden ledge. The recording timer indicated that I had captured exactly 18 minutes of flawless, uninterrupted audio. I had Sarah proudly detailing the digital forgery. I had Jason boasting about the fraudulent commercial loan secured against my property. And most importantly, I had Barbara clearly confessing to premeditated medical manipulation, elder abuse, and international flight. It was the ultimate, irrefutable confession. I secured the phone inside the zippered pocket of my canvas coat. The pain in my knee was gone now, replaced by a cold, burning adrenaline that pushed every ounce of fatigue from my muscles. I was no longer a victim waiting in the dark. I was an engineer observing a structurally compromised building, and I knew exactly which load-bearing pillars I needed to destroy to bring the criminal empire crashing down. I reached up and silently pulled the cellar door shut, plunging myself back into the darkness of the underground shaft. I descended the stone stairs with a renewed, dangerous purpose. I pushed my way out of the old iron grate, stepping back into the howling, freezing chaos of the blizzard. The wind whipped violently against my face, burying my footprints in fresh snow within seconds. I began the agonizing trek back to my truck, my mind working with ruthless precision. I could not simply drive to the local police station. A small-town sheriff would not understand the complex web of corporate fraud, offshore accounts, and federal Medicare theft. If I reported this to the wrong jurisdiction, the investigation would stall, giving Sarah the time she needed to securely transfer the funds and execute their escape plan. I needed specialized federal intervention immediately to build a flawless shield against their framing. I reached my truck and climbed inside. The war had officially begun. The physical urge to kick that wooden door off its hinges and wrap my bare, freezing hands around my son-in-law's throat was a primal, almost blinding force. Every single instinct of a betrayed husband and a discarded father screamed at me to step into the light and shatter their arrogant celebration. I wanted to see the smug, confident smiles melt off their faces in real time. I wanted to watch the sheer terror flood Barbara's eyes as she realized the foolish old man she planned to lock away in a psychiatric ward was standing right in front of her. But I forced myself to remain absolutely still. I took a slow, agonizingly shallow breath, pushing the fiery rage deep down into the pit of my stomach. An emotional outburst right now would be a catastrophic tactical error. If I confronted them without a perfectly secured, impenetrable wall of evidence, it would be my word against three highly motivated, deeply entrenched sociopaths who had already laid the medical groundwork to prove I was losing my mind. They would simply subdue me, call the local sheriff, and hand over a raving, delusional old man who had broken into their home during a raging blizzard. I had to suppress the betrayed husband and summon the structural engineer. An engineer does not attack a failing structure with a sledgehammer. He analyzes the exact points of critical weakness, gathers empirical data, and plans a controlled, devastating demolition to bring the entire rotten building to the ground. My hand moved smoothly, reaching back into the deep pocket of my heavy canvas winter coat. I retrieved my cell phone, silencing every possible notification and turning the screen brightness down to a dull, barely visible glow. I carefully ended the audio recording instantly, saving the incredibly damning 18-minute file directly to a secure, encrypted cloud server. Then I switched the application to the high-definition video camera. I raised the lens to the narrow vertical gap between the heavy wooden door and the doorframe. My hands, which had been shaking with adrenaline just moments before, were now as steady as solid stone. I pressed the record button. The digital eye of the camera peered into the bright, sterile command center. I started with the far wall, slowly panning across the massive, humming black server racks. I made sure to focus intently on the glowing computer monitors, capturing the intricate, fraudulent Medicare billing spreadsheets and the detailed patient payout schedules glowing brightly on the screens. I smoothly transitioned the angle, focusing on the large white dry erase boards. The camera drank in the stolen human lives, recording every listed social security number, every fabricated medical profile, and Sarah's precise, aggressive handwriting detailing the criminal hierarchy. I then shifted my position, adjusting my weight on the agonizingly painful knee to widen my field of view. I aimed the camera through the kitchen archway and directly into the formal dining room. I zoomed in on the horrific tableau. I recorded the massive clinical reclining medical chairs. I captured the tight, heavy nylon straps crisscrossing over the frail, sunken chests of my wife's parents. I made absolutely certain that the high-definition lens focused on their glassy, vacant eyes, their slack, drooling mouths, and the heavy padded cuffs locking their fragile wrists to the metal armrests. I panned the camera down to the stainless steel rolling cart, recording the discarded boxes of large-gauge syringes and the empty glass vials of veterinary-grade tranquilizers scattered across the metal tray. It was a flawless, irrefutable visual documentation of severe, calculated elder abuse and absolute chemical imprisonment. Finally, I pulled the camera back to the kitchen island. I filmed my daughter, my son-in-law, and my wife of 40 years standing in the warm golden light. I recorded them laughing, clinking their expensive crystal champagne flutes, and celebrating the massive corporate fraud they had entirely built upon my back. I captured the designer clothing, the sleek digital tablets, and the absolute lack of any human empathy. I lowered the phone, my heart pounding a steady, rhythmic drumbeat of pure adrenaline. I had it. I had the ultimate, undeniable proof required to bring the federal government crashing down upon their heads. I reached up with my thumb to officially save the video file when Jason's loud, arrogant voice suddenly echoed loudly through the kitchen. He set his empty crystal flute down on the granite countertop with a sharp, echoing clink. He announced to the room that a celebration of this massive magnitude absolutely required the vintage reserve. He told Barbara he was heading down to the basement wine cellar to grab a bottle of the expensive Bordeaux they had purchased with their very first fraudulent federal payout. My blood turned to absolute ice. The basement wine cellar was located at the exact bottom of the wooden staircase I was currently standing on. The heavy door I was peering through was the only physical barrier between my hidden position and the main living area. If he opened it right now, I would be instantly exposed, completely trapped in a narrow, crumbling stairwell with no possible route of escape. I heard the heavy, confident thud of his expensive leather shoes moving swiftly across the hardwood floor, heading directly toward my position. I did not have a single second to think. I slipped the phone safely back into my deep coat pocket, zipping it shut to secure the precious digital cargo, and immediately began to move. I stepped backward, lowering my weight onto the first stone step of the dark vertical shaft. My surgically repaired knee screamed in absolute fiery agony as I rapidly descended into the pitch-black root cellar. I did not dare turn on a light. I relied entirely on my spatial memory of the crumbling limestone walls and the uneven dirt floor I had meticulously reinforced 20 years prior. I practically fell down the remaining stairs, my leather gloves scraping fiercely against the rough, freezing stone as I desperately navigated the treacherous descent. The heavy wooden door at the absolute top of the stairwell suddenly clicked incredibly loudly as the brass handle was turned from the outside. A wide, brilliant beam of yellow light instantly flooded the top of the stairwell, cutting violently through the thick, musty darkness of the basement. I threw my body backward, scrambling desperately toward the far end of the underground chamber, where the old iron grate rested. The heavy rhythmic sound of Jason's footsteps began to echo loudly on the wooden stairs directly above me. He was descending rapidly, whistling a cheerful, arrogant tune that bounced off the cold stone walls. I reached the narrow vertical shaft and looked up at the freezing, swirling darkness of the howling blizzard outside. I grasped the rusted iron rungs of the grate and hauled my heavy frame upward, completely ignoring the fiery, tearing pain radiating through my joints. I dragged myself through the narrow opening and collapsed face first into the deep, freezing snowdrift. The brutal, icy wind hit me instantly, burying my presence. I lowered the iron grate perfectly flush against the ground. I was invisible. Done. I sat in the freezing cab of my heavy pickup truck, my chest heaving as the heater slowly melted, the ice crusted to my winter coat. My knee throbbed relentlessly, but the searing adrenaline pumping through my veins masked the worst of the physical exhaustion. I shifted into drive and navigated my way back onto the snow-covered county road, leaving the horrific scene far behind me in the darkness. The drive back to Chicago was a grueling, white-knuckle journey through blinding snow and treacherous ice. My hands gripped the steering wheel with bone-crushing force, my mind replaying the terrifying images I had just captured on my phone. I saw my father-in-law strapped to that vinyl chair while my own daughter casually plotted my federal incarceration. I pushed the heavy machine faster than I should have driven by the absolute necessity of beating their ticking clock. I knew I could not return to my own home. Sarah had already linked my personal address to her fraudulent corporate structure, and going back there would leave me highly vulnerable to an unexpected federal raid, or worse, to my family discovering my premature return. I needed an anonymous base of operations. I bypassed my neighborhood entirely, driving deep into the industrial outskirts of the city. I pulled into the poorly lit parking lot of a cheap, rundown roadside motel just off the interstate. I paid for the room in cash, keeping my head down, and hurried inside. The room smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial cleaner, but it had a heavy deadbolt on the solid wooden door and a small desk in the corner. That was absolutely everything I needed to begin dismantling my family's criminal empire. I tossed my heavy coat onto the sagging bed and immediately reached for my phone. I bypassed my usual corporate counsel. They were excellent for standard contract disputes and tax filings, but I was currently facing a massive federal money laundering scheme and a deeply personal betrayal. I needed a completely different class of legal representation. I needed a ruthless, unyielding shark. I dialed the private cell phone number of Gregory Pierce. Gregory was widely known throughout the Chicago legal community as an incredibly aggressive, cutthroat defense attorney who exclusively handled high-stakes, high-profile corporate warfare. We did not socialize, but we shared a profound, unspoken bond. Decades ago, when Gregory was just a struggling, desperate junior associate, he had made a catastrophic error on a structural liability case that would have completely ended his career and sent him to prison. I had personally stepped in, quietly providing the precise engineering analytics and expert testimony required to totally exonerate him, asking for absolutely nothing in return. He had owed me his entire professional life ever since, and I was finally calling in the debt. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. His voice was thick with sleep, confused by the caller identification flashing across his screen at 2 a.m. I did not bother with pleasantries. I told him I was in severe, immediate danger of being framed for a massive federal felony by my own family, and I needed him at my location instantly. There was a brief, stunned silence on the other end of the line. Then, without a single question, Gregory simply asked for the exact address. He arrived exactly 40 minutes later, stepping into the dingy motel room, wearing a heavy wool overcoat over a hastily buttoned dress shirt. He looked entirely out of place in the cheap surroundings, his sharp, predatory eyes scanning the room before settling on my exhausted face. I did not waste any time. I sat him down at the small laminate desk and laid out my phone alongside the printed banking anomalies and the suspicious credit card charges I had documented before my trip to Wisconsin. I played the audio file first. Gregory sat perfectly still, his hands steepled under his chin, listening to the crystal-clear recording of Jason bragging about the $2.5 million commercial loan taken out in my name. He listened to Barbara casually discuss my worsening memory and her plan to commit me to a psychiatric ward. He listened to Sarah, my own flesh and blood, gleefully explaining how she had wired the digital paper trail to guarantee I would take the absolute fall for the massive Medicare fraud. Gregory's professional, stoic demeanor began to crack. His jaw tightened, and a look of profound, genuine horror washed over his features. Then I opened the video file. I showed him the high-definition footage of the sterile command center operating inside the old farmhouse. I showed him the whiteboards covered in stolen human lives and federal payout schedules. Finally, I showed him the dining room. I watched Gregory's eyes widen in absolute disgust as he saw the drugged, heavily sedated bodies of Barbara's parents strapped securely to the vinyl medical recliners. He watched the agonizing footage of the discarded veterinary tranquilizers and the undeniable proof of horrific calculated elder abuse. When the video finally ended, the silence in the cheap motel room was incredibly heavy. Gregory slowly closed his eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath before opening them again. The horror had completely vanished instantly, replaced by the cold, calculating, and exceptionally dangerous legal mind that made him the most feared attorney in the city. He looked at me, his voice dropping to a low, deadly whisper, declaring that they had made a fatal mistake by giving me a head start. He immediately pulled a sleek silver laptop from his leather briefcase and opened it on the desk. His fingers flew across the keyboard with blinding speed. He explained his strategy with rapid military precision. First, we were going to sever their financial lifelines. He began drafting emergency ex parte injunctions to completely freeze every single corporate account associated with the fraudulent hospice care front. He utilized his high-level banking contacts to place immediate, ironclad holds on my personal assets, ensuring Sarah could not siphon another single dime to fund their escape to Geneva. We were effectively locking them inside a financial cage. But the most critical step was the federal intervention. Gregory pulled out his phone, explaining that going through standard local law enforcement channels would take weeks of bureaucratic delays, giving Sarah more than enough time to execute her digital framing. We needed a massive, overwhelming, and instantaneous strike. He dialed a highly classified direct number. He was calling a senior director within the Federal Bureau of Investigation's white-collar crime division, a man who owed Gregory his own share of political favors. Gregory spoke quietly into the receiver, using precise federal statutes and legal terminology. He detailed the multi-million-dollar Medicare fraud, the severe elder abuse, and the imminent flight risk of the primary suspects. He emphasized that we possessed absolute, irrefutable audio and visual evidence, and that the primary target they intended to frame was sitting right next to him. He finished the call and he looked at me. The trap was set, and the absolute destruction of their massive criminal empire was finally underway. The next 2 days moved with the very slow, deliberate precision of a ticking metronome. I returned to my home in Chicago, walking through the familiar rooms with the clinical detachment of a forensic auditor evaluating a crime scene. I made a fresh pot of coffee, pouring myself a heavy ceramic mug, and took my usual seat in the leather armchair facing the front entryway. I did not turn on the television or read the morning paper. I simply sat in the absolute quiet of the sprawling house, waiting for the architect of my intended demise to walk through the front door. Gregory and his federal contacts had moved with breathtaking speed. The financial traps were completely armed, the digital nets were entirely deployed, and the federal agents were quietly moving into their designated positions around my property. I was no longer a victim waiting for the executioner. I was the warden calmly waiting to lock the cell door. At exactly 2 p.m, the heavy oak front door swung open. Barbara stepped into the foyer, bringing a sudden rush of cold winter air with her. She closed the door gently, leaning her back against the solid wood, with a loud theatrical sigh of profound exhaustion. She shrugged off her heavy wool coat, hanging it meticulously on the brass rack, and turned to face me. Her performance was absolutely flawless. She had expertly applied a subtle layer of makeup to emphasize the dark, heavy circles under her eyes, and her posture was slumped, projecting the image of a deeply devoted daughter who had just endured a harrowing medical vigil. She walked into the living room, dropping her expensive leather handbag onto the sofa, and offered me a weak, tremulous smile. She walked over to my chair and placed a cold, gentle hand on my shoulder. She told me she was so incredibly sorry for leaving me alone, but the blizzard had made the roads completely impassable. She sighed again, rubbing her temples, and whispered that her parents had finally stabilized. According to her beautiful, poisonous lie, the private nurses had managed to regulate their breathing, and they were currently resting comfortably under heavy, compassionate sedation. She looked down at me with deep, manufactured affection, whispering that she could not wait to just sleep in her own bed and put this terrible nightmare behind them. I looked up into the familiar brown eyes of the woman I had married 40 years ago. I searched deeply for any microscopic trace of the monster I had witnessed in the farmhouse dining room, but her mask was entirely impenetrable. If I had not stood in that freezing root cellar, if I had not heard her casually plan my committal to a psychiatric ward, I would have believed every single word she spoke. I took a slow, measured sip of my black coffee, letting the bitter warmth ground my racing heartbeat. I reached out and gently removed her hand from my shoulder. I told her that I was incredibly relieved to hear that her parents were resting so peacefully. I kept my voice perfectly level, devoid of any emotional inflection, matching the steady, calculated rhythm of my engineering blueprints. Barbara frowned, a brief flicker of genuine confusion crossing her expression. She asked me what I meant. Without breaking eye contact, I reached down to this glass coffee table and picked up my silver electronic tablet. I unlocked the screen, loaded the high-definition video file from the basement stairwell, and slid the heavy device across the smooth glass surface directly toward her waiting hands. Barbara looked down at the glowing screen, her initial confusion rapidly morphing into absolute, paralyzing terror. The audio was turned up to its maximum volume. The quiet Chicago living room was instantly filled with the sharp, festive sound of crystal champagne flutes clinking together. Then her own voice echoed out from the tablet speakers, crisp and perfectly clear, boldly declaring that if the Department of Health audited the property, they would already be living in Geneva. The video panned smoothly across the sterile command center, highlighting the humming black servers and the whiteboards completely covered in stolen Social Security numbers. Then the camera lens shifted, focusing directly on the horrific scene in the dining room. The screen displayed her frail, elderly parents, strapped securely to the vinyl medical recliners, drooling and heavily sedated with unprescribed veterinary tranquilizers. I watched Barbara's physical reaction with cold, clinical fascination. The vibrant color completely drained from her face, leaving her skin an unhealthy ashen gray. Her jaw dropped open, pulling her mouth into a silent, gaping scream. Her hands began to shake violently, trembling so hard that she had to grip the edge of the glass coffee table to keep from collapsing onto the floor. The flawless, loving persona she had worn for 40 years instantly shattered into pieces, exposing the raw, desperate sociopath hiding underneath. She took a sudden, staggering step backward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She managed to choke out my name, begging me to listen, claiming it was a terrible misunderstanding, and that Jason forced her. She desperately tried to convince me that she was actually the victim. I simply did not let her finish the desperate, pathetic sentence. I stood up from my leather armchair, towering over her trembling frame. I looked down at her with absolute disgust. I told her to save her breath, because the time for theatrical performances was entirely over, and there was nothing left to say. I informed her in a voice as cold and hard as solid steel that I had driven straight from the farmhouse to the office of the most aggressive corporate defense attorney in Chicago. I watched her eyes widen in absolute horror as I methodically dismantled her escape plan. I told her that Gregory had already filed emergency federal injunctions. Every single corporate bank account tied to the Ghost Hospice Clinic was completely frozen. The massive commercial loan they had fraudulently secured against my property was locked down. Her personal accounts, Jason offshore routing numbers, and Sarah digital funds were entirely inaccessible. They could not move a single dime. Barbara spun around, her survival instincts taking over, lunging desperately toward the front door. I did not move to physically stop her. I simply raised my voice, cutting through her panic. I told her that her passport had just been flagged by federal authorities at every international airport and border crossing. There would be no flight to Geneva. There would be no luxurious retirement on stolen funds. Barbara froze, with her hand resting heavily on the brass doorknob, her entire body shaking with the sudden, crushing realization of her absolute defeat. I took a very slow step forward, looking at the broken woman cornered in my foyer, and suggested she look out the front window before she opened that door. I told her that a highly specialized team of federal agents from the White-Collar Crime Division had completely surrounded the perimeter of the house, and they were simply waiting for my signal to execute the arrest warrants. The trap had sprung, and there was absolutely no escape. The heavy silence that followed my declaration was abruptly shattered by 3 deafening, authoritative knocks on the front door. The sound echoed through the high ceilings of the foyer like the crack of a judge's gavel. Before Barbara could even attempt to move her paralyzed limbs, the heavy wooden door was thrust open from the outside. A dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical gear and navy blue windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation poured into my home. They moved with absolute terrifying precision, fanning out across the polished hardwood floors to secure every exit and clear every room. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with a grim, weathered face, stepped directly past me without saying a single word. He walked straight toward my trembling wife. He firmly instructed her to place her hands behind her back, formally, announcing that she was being placed under federal arrest for massive corporate fraud, identity theft, and severe medical endangerment of vulnerable adults. Barbara let out a sharp, breathless gasp, stumbling backward until her shoulders hit the wall. 2 agents immediately stepped forward, grabbing her wrists with professional, unyielding force. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting securely into place sounded loud in the otherwise silent room. I remained standing still by my leather armchair, holding my mug of black coffee, watching the physical manifestation of her complete and total ruin. I knew that at this precise moment, 400 miles away in the frozen wilderness of Wisconsin, a nearly identical scene of tactical devastation was unfolding. Gregory had coordinated the simultaneous strikes flawlessly, ensuring that not a single member of the conspiracy could reach out and warn the others. I pictured the heavy armored vehicles tearing up the snow-covered logging trail, smashing right through the heavy industrial chain and the wrought iron security gate that Sarah had so confidently installed. I imagined the heavily armed federal strike team swarming the perimeter of the dark, isolated farmhouse, bypassing the expensive, overlapping camera network by simply kicking the reinforced front door off its hinges. The sterile, high-technology command center that had been meticulously designed to funnel millions of stolen dollars into offshore accounts was currently being dismantled piece by piece. Federal agents were actively seizing the humming black servers, confiscating the glowing monitors, and photographing the massive dry erase boards covered in the stolen Social Security numbers of phantom patients. And most importantly, I knew that emergency medical services were rushing into that formal dining room. Highly trained paramedics were finally cutting through the heavy nylon straps and padded wrist cuffs, gently lifting my father-in-law and mother-in-law from their vinyl prisons. They were being carefully loaded into warm, waiting ambulances, completely surrounded by actual, compassionate medical professionals. Gregory had already arranged for their immediate transfer to a legitimate, highly rated, and fully staffed memory care facility in a secure location completely funded by the emergency liquidation of Jason's frozen corporate assets. The horrifying chemical imprisonment my wife had subjected them to was officially over forever. Sarah and Jason were not packing their designer luggage for a luxurious flight to Geneva. They were being violently dragged out into the freezing blizzard in tight handcuffs. Their expensive corporate clothing soaked with snow, completely stripped of their stolen wealth and their arrogant pride. Back in my Chicago foyer, the reality of the situation finally managed to penetrate the thick, delusional armor of Barbara's sociopathic mind. As the federal agents began to firmly guide her toward the open front door, and the flashing red and blue lights of the waiting vehicles outside the flawless mask of the devoted loving wife completely disintegrated, she dug her heels into the hardwood floor, twisting her body aggressively against the grip of the officers. She turned her head, fixing her wild, frantic eyes directly on me. The sheer, unadulterated venom in her gaze was absolutely staggering. She began to scream, her voice a harsh, guttural shriek that scraped against the walls of the elegant house. She cursed me with words I had never heard her use in our 40 years of marriage. She called me a pathetic, worthless old man, screaming that I was nothing without her, and that I deserved to die alone and miserable. The agents pulled harder, warning her to stop resisting, but the adrenaline of her cornered panic gave her a sudden burst of frantic strength. When the vicious insults failed to elicit a single reaction from my stoic posture, her fractured mind violently shifted gears. The furious screaming instantly evaporated, replaced by a sudden theatrical flood of desperate tears. Her knees buckled intentionally, forcing the agents to hold her upright. She began to beg, her voice dropping into a pitiful, trembling whine. She cried out my name, pleading with me to tell them it was all a terrible mistake. She swore that she deeply loved me, that she had always deeply loved me, and that she was only trying to secure our financial future because she was terrified of growing old and poor. She pleaded with me to call my powerful lawyers, to use my corporate influence to stop the arrest, promising that she would do absolutely anything I wanted if I just saved her from a cold concrete cell. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, a desperate final attempt to exploit the decades of deep, unwavering loyalty I had freely given her. But she was performing for an audience that no longer existed. The man who would have moved heaven and earth to protect her had died in the freezing, damp darkness of that Wisconsin root cellar, eradicated by the sound of her own voice casually plotting his medical framing. I looked at the sobbing, desperate woman struggling in the grip of the federal agents. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel a shred of lingering affection. I felt absolutely, profoundly nothing. The emotional void inside my chest was vast, cold, and serene. I watched as her theatrical tears streaked through her careful makeup, leaving dark, messy trails down her ashen cheeks. The sheer panic radiating from her trembling body was the exact same terror she had planned to inflict upon me in a locked psychiatric ward. I slowly raised the heavy ceramic mug to my lips and took a calm, measured sip of my dark coffee. The bitter, robust flavor grounded me perfectly in the reality of the present moment. I lowered the mug and met her frantic, weeping gaze with absolute, chilling indifference. The silence stretching between us was heavier than any physical blow. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the absolute, undeniable finality of the moment wash completely over me, washing away the last fragile, clinging remnants of the 40 years we had spent building a life together. I spoke my final words to her in a voice so smooth, so entirely devoid of any emotion that it caused her pleading to instantly die in her throat. You wanted to leave me alone to rot in a cold, locked psychiatric cell, Barbara. I just gave you the ultimate permanent head start. 6 months have passed since that freezing winter afternoon when the flashing lights of federal vehicles illuminated my driveway and took my former life away in handcuffs. The absolute silence that settled over the sprawling Chicago house after the agents departed was not a lonely silence. It was the profound, heavy quiet of a surgically excised tumor, the clean feeling of a massive infection finally being drawn from the body. I did not spend a single night mourning the family I had lost, because the people I thought I loved had never actually existed. They were merely sophisticated parasites, wearing familiar masks, completely driven by cold greed and sociopathic ambition. The federal indictments came down like a swift, merciless hammer. Gregory Pierce, true to his formidable reputation, ensured that the prosecutor possessed an absolutely impenetrable mountain of evidence. The digital footprints Sarah had so arrogantly designed to frame me became the exact cement used to build her own prison cell. Jason and his offshore accounts were completely seized and liquidated to compensate the federal government and the legitimate victims of their massive fraud. Barbara, the woman who had spent 40 years sleeping beside me, the woman who had meticulously planned to lock me in a sterile psychiatric ward, is currently facing 25 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and severe elder abuse. Sarah and Jason are facing similar devastating sentences. There will be no elegant escape to Geneva. There will be no luxurious retirement funded by stolen blood money. They will spend the rest of their natural lives surrounded by cold concrete walls and steel bars, completely stripped of their designer clothing and their arrogant superiority. The massive Chicago house with its imported granite countertops and expansive living rooms felt entirely contaminated. Every single room held a ghost of their calculated deception. I placed the property on the real estate market, within a week of the raid, selling it to a young, energetic family who saw only beautiful architecture instead of a crime scene. I completely liquidated my remaining corporate assets, quietly stepping away from the ruthless, profit-driven business world that had so easily corrupted my own daughter. I took my reclaimed wealth and moved into a comfortable, modestly sized apartment closer to the heart of the city, a place where the air felt clean and my mind could finally breathe. My former wife and her parents, the true silent victims of her horrific cruelty, are now living in a beautiful, legitimate, and highly specialized memory care facility located just outside the city limits. I visit them every single Sunday. The heavy, chemical fog of the veterinary tranquilizers has completely lifted from their minds. While their natural memory is still fading, they are safe, genuinely cared for, and treated with the absolute dignity and profound respect that every single human being deserves in their final years. They smile when I walk into the room, holding my hands and sharing quiet, peaceful moments in the warm afternoon sunlight. They do not remember the dark, freezing farmhouse, and I will gladly carry that terrible burden so they never have to. I realized very quickly that sitting idly in a quiet apartment was not going to heal the deep, lingering wounds of my betrayal. A structural engineer does not simply stop building just because one building collapsed. He analyzes the failure, reinforces the foundation, and builds something infinitely stronger. I decided to channel my decades of specialized engineering experience into something that actually mattered. I partnered with a highly respected local charity organization dedicated to designing and constructing safe, affordable, and accessible community housing for vulnerable, low-income senior citizens. People who have been abandoned, forgotten, or exploited by the very system designed to protect them. People who desperately need a secure fortress against a world that often views them as disposable. This morning I am standing on the dusty, vibrant construction site of our newest residential project. The warm golden sunlight of early summer beats down comfortably on my shoulders, chasing away the bitter memories of that howling winter blizzard. The air is thick with the sharp, clean smell of freshly cut pine lumber and pouring concrete. The rhythmic, steady pounding of hammers and the loud roar of heavy machinery is a beautiful symphony of actual, tangible progress. My surgically repaired knee still aches occasionally, but it is a good, honest pain born from hard, meaningful labor, not the terrible, desperate agony of a man crawling through a freezing root cellar. I am wearing scuffed leather work boots, faded denim jeans, and a bright yellow hard hat. I am surrounded by a dedicated team of passionate architects, young, eager apprentices, and seasoned construction workers who treat me with genuine, unforced respect. They do not look at my bank account. They do not plot against my legacy. They look at the structural blueprints I hold in my calloused hands, listening intently to my advice as we build something beautiful together. Every single nail we drive into the wood feels like a small, personal victory over the greedy, parasitic forces that tried to consume me. I have found a completely new, chosen family in the people I work alongside, and the vulnerable elders we are working so fiercely to protect. I take a slow, deep breath of the dusty summer air, looking out over the wooden framing of the new community center. The hollow, agonizing void that Barbara and Sarah left in my chest has been entirely filled with a profound, unshakable peace. The nightmares that plagued my sleep during the first few weeks after the federal raid have completely vanished. I no longer wake up in a cold sweat, imagining the sound of heavy footsteps descending into the dark basement. Instead, I sleep the deep, restorative sleep of a man who knows his soul is clean. I look up at the bright blue sky above the wooden rafters, feeling an overwhelming sense of profound gratitude. I survived the ultimate betrayal. I am free. I dismantled the devils hiding inside my own home. I completely protected my honor, and I reclaimed my dignity from the jaws of absolute destruction. I am an engineer, and I have finally built a life that no one can ever tear down. The most painful lesson I learned at 70 years old is that blood does not guarantee loyalty, and a familiar face can hide the most calculating monster. We spend our lives building a fortress to protect our families, only to realize the real danger was already sitting at the dining table. Never ignore your gut feeling, and never let your unconditional love blind you to the cold, hard facts. True strength is not about maintaining a broken family. It is about having the courage to tear down the facade and protect your own dignity, no matter how much it hurts. If my story resonated today, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you completely trusted? Share your experience in the comments below. Let me know what city you are watching from because it means the world to me.